Myths of the Dogman by David Gordon White. Chapter 6. Central Asia, the Vortex of Cynanthropy. 1. Dog-faced men, Ephthalite Huns, and kingdoms of women in Indian traditions. In India, we find a significant number of myths in which dogs stand as metonyms for their outcast masters, who are themselves often called dog cookers or dog milkers. At this point, we ought to venture beyond ideology and typology and attempt to glimpse the ethnological or historiographical grounding of these uses. The Hindus and Buddhists could have chosen some other patently revolting creature, such as the vulture, rat, or swine, to depict metaphorically their social pariahs. Yet, whenever outcasts are to be censured, reviled, or rejected, it is the canine trope that prevails. Could it be that, as with the Sabaras and the Ao-Nagas, the dog cookers of these pious and didactic traditions really did maintain a relationship with their dogs that was something more than economical? When we review the many myths of dog cookers and their dogs in Hindu mythology, it is striking to note how many locate these peoples to the north of India. We find this in the Cynanthropy myth, the earliest origin myth of the outcast peoples, in which the disobedient sons of Visvamitra are exiled to or beyond the northern limit. In the Yoga Vasistha, Gadi rules as Gavala in the northern kingdom of Kira. When Gadi goes to learn who he was, he goes to the land of the Huns in the north. Kakura Varman is a king of Kashmir who falls prey to the wiles of lascivious Svapaki or Dambi girls, also from the north. We also find in myths of dog cookers a certain conflation of indigenous outcast peoples together with foreign tribes or ethnic groups. To name but a few sources, we find such mixing of categories in the Cynanthropy myth, the Amarakosa lists, and the myth of Visvamitra's defeat at the hands of the armies created from Nandini's excrements. In a variant of the Vena myth, it is said that, in addition to causing people to marry outside of their castes, by which he gave rise to the outcast races, Vena himself also fathers a son named Barbara, foreign Barbarian. From this son are descended the foreign tribes. The question is, therefore, which came first, the northern barbarian dog cooker, dog milker, or the indigenous outcast dog cooker? Do the terms Kandala, Svapaka, and Svapeka all refer to both barbarians and outcasts? Were they all perceived as one and the same people? What importance should we attach, beyond some ideological stamp, to these people's association, if not identification, with the dog? It should be recalled that, until the time of the epics and law books, shortly before the beginning of the Common Era, there is very little evidence to indicate a devaluation of the dog in Hindu ideology. It is precisely in this period that we first find reference to the peoples living north of India in the sacred texts. If a connection is to be drawn, then, between these two phenomena, we must look for it in the shadowy world of Indian historiography. Before we look at these Indian sources, a few remarks of a more general nature are in order. In Indian, as in European and Chinese ideology, the four corners of a square left uncovered by the circumference of an inscribed circle were the haunts of monstrous and barbarian races. The circle in the square was a conceptual model that all three employed. However, when we bring together the specific historiographic material of all three traditions, we find that 1. The Europeans generally placed their Amazons, cynocephaly, and other monsters far to the east in quote-unquote India. 2. The Indians placed their barbarians, fallen Kshatriyas, dog cookers, and kingdoms of women to the north and west. And 3. The Chinese located many of their barbarian dogmen and, as we shall see, kingdoms of women to the south and west. By extrapolation, the point of intersection for all three of these traditions would have been Central Asia, what is today Tibet, Western China, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, and Kashmir. Therefore, let us provisionally hypothesize an ethnographic or historical homeland for the dogmen of our three traditions in the general region of Central Asia. Let us also note here that the Western, Indian, and Chinese traditions quite often agree with one another when they juxtapose their dogmen with the homelands of the Amazons, kingdoms of women. We will show in this and the following chapters that this juxtaposition may have a Central Asian ethnogenic myth or the practice of polyandry at its origin. We have already seen examples in previous chapters of what we called Asianism, the fear and dread on the part of a Western center of that which is foreign. The case is no different in Asia. The wondrous peoples living beyond the northernmost or westernmost mountains provoke not only fascination, but also terror. So it is that in India and China, as in the West, there have been a general blurring of distinctions, not only between various barbarian invaders, but also between barbarian invaders and their more peaceable neighbors. Just as in Europe, where the tendency was to group Scythians, Huns, Parthians, and Muslims together under the heading of Turks, barbarians, or incorrigible races, so too, the Indians often conflated the names and cultural uniqueness of their many northern and western barbarians, while the Chinese did the same for their barbarians of the north, west, and south. Out of this confusion, there emerged two salient points about myths of the dogman. The first of these is that a number of Central Asian peoples, including the Ephthalite Huns and certain Turco-Mongol and Tibetan peoples, were polyandrous, with women playing a more prominent role in society than in the male-dominated traditions of the West, India, and China. The second involves the ethnogenic myths of many of these same peoples, who often identified themselves as the descendants of a primal union between a male dog or wolf and a female human. When these ethnological data were translated into the Western, Indian, or Chinese sources, a certain transformation occurred. On the one hand, the relative dominance of women within these Central Asian societies gave rise to the perception from afar that they were gynecocracies. They were thus duly termed kingdoms of women. On the other hand, these women's spouses, the men of these societies, were perceived both as cruel and lawless barbarians, because these peoples did in fact invade civilization at times. And as dogmen, even cynocephaly, by virtue of their indigenous dog ancestry myths. Central Asian peoples, not possessed of such an ethnogenic myth, may nevertheless have been thrown by their Indian, Chinese, and European interpreters, together with their semi-canine neighbors. And, most importantly, their ethnogenic myths became skewed in the retelling, with the human women and canine male of the original accounts being transformed in the Western, Indian, and Chinese material into Amazon women and dog men. To be sure, we find ourselves incapable of judging with any degree of certainty the point at which ethnography ends and ideology and propaganda begin in these three great traditions' depictions of their barbarian dogmen/Amazon races. The reason for this is simple. With a few notable exceptions, the Mongols, Tokharians, and Uyghurs, very few of these Central Asian people who concern us here had a written language with which to document their own beliefs and practices. And even when they did have their own literary traditions, they were not heeded by the literati of the great traditions. For all intents and purposes, they themselves and the world at large have been held in thrall by Western, Indian, and Chinese interpreters of their culture and society, a state of affairs that is slowly being reversed in the present century through the efforts of scholars of Central Asian studies. While we can be certain that these peoples did not locate themselves at the corners of their own maps of the universe, we remain in the dark concerning many of the details of their ancient worldviews. In the documents of the great traditions, they are ultimately dismissed as subhuman floods that briefly washed over the edifice of civilization before being definitely driven back by the armies of the same civilization. They are a negativity, a blank space on the fringes of the conceptual map of each of these traditions' self-centered universes. Here, for the time period that concerns us, 3rd century BC to 6th century AD, India's Great North passed through the hands of no less than 5 different peoples or empires. These were the Parthians, Bactrian Greeks, Indo-Scythians, Tokharians, and Ephthalite Huns. Of the 5 peoples in this series, all of whom conquered and ruled portions of northern and western India, the last 2 may well have had indigenous myths of canine ancestry, myths they would have shared in common with a great number of non-Indo-European Central Asian peoples. The Parathas, Yavanas, and Sakas were generally listed together with the Kushanas and Hunas, and many other fallen Kshatriya people of the Indian Great North, with little discrimination made between their mores or practices. Generally, all were broadly identified with the outcast or barbarian Mlechas, Kandalas, or Svapakas, and with a group called the 5 Hordes, the Panka Gana. Apart from the canine ancestry myth shared by many of these peoples, we also find in Central Asia a living, popular tradition of cynocephaly. First, there is in Tibet and the Chinese province of Qinghai a rich indigenous tradition of dog-headed demons that may be magically created and manipulated to increase one's own wealth and to bring tribulations down upon one's enemies. This modern ethnology is complemented by archaeological evidence. In the 1920s, a French team of archaeologists unearthed at Hatta in eastern Afghanistan a veritable treasure trove of sculpted figures. The site had been a Buddhist monastery located on the Silk Road in the first centuries of the Common Era. In the centuries prior to and contemporary with the Ephthalite Hun conquests of Central Asia, the artifacts brought to light there attest to a truly cosmopolitan milieu. Greek-style Zeus figures jostle with Chinese Buddhas. But most amazing are a collection of demons' heads in stucco, unearthed at Hatta, now on display at the Musée Guimet in Paris. According to the French scholar René Grousset, these heads are stylized representations of various Central Asian barbarians who are here in a sculpted rendition of the Buddha's enlightenment, soldiers in the army of Mara. Some 20 heads represent demons of every stripe, with twisted physiognomies, heads with smaller heads in their mouths, and other deformities. Leading this ghoulish parade is a piece aptly identified as a dog-headed demon. Perhaps here, in Hatta, is the archaeological missing link to Central Asian traditions of cynocephaly and Cynanthropy. Tibet and Afghanistan are precisely the 2 regions in which medieval Indian sources located their dogmen and kingdoms of women, both of which seem to identify, as we will show, with the Hunas, the Ephthalite Huns. These 2 quote-unquote Indian locations are, moreover, seconded by both Western and Chinese sources. Varahamihira is the most systematic Indian source on this subject. In the Birhat Samhita, he locates the kingdom of women to the west, the Parathas and Sakas to the northwest, and the Hunas and Svamukas to the north of India. This last people, whose name means dog faces or dog heads, is one of the rare Indian references to a race of cynocephalic men. Another instance of the same identification may be elicited from the Kubai Kamada Tantra, which assigns Svamukas to the Uttaraptha, the northern path. It is intriguing to find in the Indian material, as we have in the European context, a textual, if not geographical, juxtaposition of dog-headed men, with both a kingdom of women called the Amazons in the west, and with the Parthians, Indo-Scythians, and Huns. In the west, this juxtaposition was reinforced by a tendency to conflate the latter 3 groups together with whoever was invading from the north or east at a given time. Furthermore, the 5 were all brought together in the lists of the Inclusi that continued the tradition of Pseudo-Callisthenes and Pseudo-Methodius. In these sources, these people are walled outside of oikomene because of their cannibalism, abominable eating habits, and unspeakable impurity. This last element has a foreign ring to it in the Western texts. Yet it fits very well with the Indian ideology of the outcast or foreigner as impure pariah. With the Birhat Samhita, might we be in the presence of a parallel Indian source to this perennial motif of the Alexander legend? While the emphasis on impurity may very well be Indian, its source ought to be sought further to the north and east. In the Indian context, we find more material concerning kingdoms of women than we do explicit references to the Svamukhas, their dog-headed neighbors. The latter may nonetheless be glimpsed in the background in Indian accounts of both northern and western kingdoms of women, as well as of such barbarian peoples as the Hunas. In his chronicle of the kings of Kashmir, the Raja Taramgini, Kalhana makes a number of references to the women warriors of the northern kingdom of Srirajaya. While he offers little more than a glimpse of their breasts, his emphasis on this element to the exclusion of all others may also betray a familiarity with a more universal Amazon, one-breasted tradition. Kalhana also assigns a northern provenance to the two powerful women who caused the downfall of the Kashmiri king, Kakura Varman. These two girls are referenced to as both Svapakis and Dombis, the name of another outcast group. In fact, Doms, of which Dombi is the feminine form, entered into India from the north during or shortly before the Gupta age. Elsewhere, Kalhana mentions the Srirajaya on a list of foreign or barbarian peoples that more or less repeats earlier Mahabharata traditions. In one of its many barbarian lists, this epic source locates the following peoples outside of and to the west of India: the Yavanas, Sakas, Harahunas, Sainas, Tukaras, Saindavas, Jagudas, Ramathas, Mundas, Srirajayas, the kingdom of women, Tanganas, and Simhalas. In the Mahabharata, the Kambojas, Sabaras, Kiratas, and Barbaras are added to the list. Some of these people, the Yavanas, Kambojas, and Sakas, are among those referred to in the Harivamsa as the Five Hordes, who, along with the Haihayas and the Talajankas, were the enemies of the Ikshvaku king, Sagara. We cannot totally fault the Indian sources for the confusion in these lists. The names of the Central Asian peoples represented in them were fluid, since theirs were constantly shifting confederations, alliances, and ethnic mixes, occurring in regions quite distant from the borders of India proper. So, for example, the Kushans were a federation of 5 tribes called the Great Yuchi. However, Chinese sources state that the Ephthalite Huns are descended from the Yuchi, a group that also interacted or federated with other groups to form the Wanwans, the Avars of European traditions, and the Tuchu, the Turks. Another account of a foreign people whose women dominated the social sphere is found in the Mahabharata description of the land of the Balikas. In this account, the Kaurava general Karna scorns the Balikas by way of insulting Salya, a fellow officer and the king of the Madras, the Medians of Persia. Salya's sister is Madri, who is also called Baliki. Balika is Balkh, the capital of Bactria, or the name for the entire region, also called Gandhara, in modern Afghanistan. This account refers to the capital city of the Balikas, however, as Sakala, the modern Sialkot, located on the Jhelum River in the Punjab region of modern-day Pakistan. 2 Balika clan names are introduced in this passage. These are the Aratas and the Jartikas. This latter name refers to the Indian Jats, the people said to be descended from the Hunas, the Ephthalite Huns in some sources, yet said to have defeated those same Hunas in another. Both the Balikas, as we shall see, and the Hunas bore a special relationship to their women. More than this, both are associated with the 2 cities of Balkh and Sakala. These were Huna capitals on the eve of the Huna conquest of India in the late 5th century. Yet the 2 are mentioned as separate peoples in the Birhat Samhita. In his tirade against Salya, Karna spells out the abominations of his subjects. They are shunned by the Ganges, the 5 rivers, and the Himalayas. They eat beef and garlic and drink liquor. They are the product of the intermarriage of Sudra men with women of higher castes, and they eat from the wooden and earthen vessels that have been licked by dogs. The greater part of Karna's scorn is reserved for the Balika women, however. These, intoxicated and randy with drink, wearing neither clothing, garlands, nor cosmetics, dance wildly in the streets, singing drunken ditties that resemble the braying of asses or camels. Ha hate, slain my husband, slain my lord. They are totally without restraint in sex and every other pursuit. If the Malechas are the scum of mankind, then the Mustikas are the scum of the Malechas, the Sandas the scum of the Mustikas, and the Madrakas the scum of the Sandas. As for the Madraka women, they are the scum of womankind. Then, to clinch this argument, Karna tells of a curse pronounced by a Brahmin girl who had been violated by Balika men. Because of this curse, Balika women are unchaste, and it is their sisters' daughters and not their sons who are their heirs in Balika families. There are two complementary points to be retained from this passage. First is the ad hominem attack made on Salya, which is in fact an attack ad mulieres, more on the subject of the women of the region than on Salya himself. Second is the unusual trait of matrilineal inheritance, coupled with the place names given in the narrative, which would indicate that the Balika or Madraka women were the unchaste spouses of the Ephthalite Huns. These are the dread Hunas of the Rajataramgini and other Indian sources, and the peoples whose lands were the Huna Mandala of the Gadi myth. That they were dreaded and despised enough to be made out as cuckolds in Indian traditions is a possibility, but that they were the unique matrilineal society of Central Asia is supported by Chinese sources. They, the Ephthalites, also have a custom by which elder and younger brother marry one wife. If one has no elder or younger brother, his wife wears a one-horned hat. If one has brothers, horns are added to the hat, according to their number. It is, perhaps, this social structure, combined with indigenous myths of dog ancestry, as well as the behavior of what would appear to have been a very liberated group of women, that gave rise to the tradition of a kingdom of women in the same region as the lands of the barbarian Hunas and the dog men. Ultimately, the epic compilers may have split the Ephthalite Huns into male dogs and female Amazons, in accordance with their practices of polyandry and their possession of a dog ancestry myth, both of which would have been vaguely reported to the people of India. Such facts may also account for the theme of Scythians or cynocephaly living together with Amazons that we find in Western traditions, as well as juxtaposition in Chinese sources of Supai, Huns, a kingdom of women and a kingdom of dogs. It is also possible that a tradition of independent but dissolute women living with terrible and despised men represents a fusion of two facets of India's reaction toward its empirical others. On the one hand, the unknown is exotic and fascinating, but on the other, it is fearsome and repugnant. These are the attitudes we call Asianism and Atticism in an earlier chapter. Here they might be referred to as Hyperboreanism and Ephthalism. We have treated Ephthalism in the preceding pages. Hyperboreanism, which depicts the North as a blessed abode of redemption and pleasure, is a perspective also found in Indian sources that are moreover supported by Chinese materials. This is the tradition of the land of the Uttara Kurus, the land lying to the north of the Himalayas, and of Mount Meru, the central pillar of the universe. Indian evidence concerning a northern paradise of life and independent women, material that complements Kalhana's references to the northern Srirajaya, is found at the end of the Mahabharata passage on the western Balika women. Following Karna's tirade, an unnamed warrior in Salya's army retorts by lamenting the fate that has carried him so far away from his beloved jungles of Kuru. Identified elsewhere in the epic with the Uttara Kurus. There, he says, to the north of the 6 rivers, his beloved women await him. They are fair-skinned, tall and beautiful, with vulvas like great conch shells, dark, flashing eyes ornamented with collyrium. Women who wear only blankets and furs, and who play drums and sing in voices that, it must be allowed, resemble the braying of asses and camels. It is held, moreover, that the women of Uttarakuru are the sole remaining practitioners of the ancient law by which women, unbound by the constraints of marriage, take their pleasure with the men of their choice, as do animal creatures today. Yet another Indian portrayal of independent, nymph-like girls from the North Country is found in the Buddhist Petavathu. Here, female ghosts, petis, live in isolation, luring humans to their distant lands by floating mangoes down their river. A prince who mounts the river to its headwaters and the Peti's haunt falls in love with one of them, but finds that she is flayed alive every night by a dog. In the Kedar Kalpa, an allegorical ascent of the Himalayas and of the successive stages to yogic liberation, two heroic travelers pass through the mountain kingdom of the Queen of Kampika. Here they are offered, for their pleasure, 100,000 women and a 10,000-year lifespan. These they eschew, knowing that immortality awaits them on a higher plane. The land of Uttarakuru is portrayed in the Ramayana as a land on the northern ocean that is so far to the north that the sun and moon shed no light on it. It is undoubtedly this land that inspired Ptolemy's Uttarakura, which he located in China, Pliny's Attakuri, whom he placed near the Tocharians, and Megasthene's Hyperboreans. There, according to both Indian and Greek sources, people lived for 1,000 years in a land strewn with gold and precious stones, a land where the women were particularly affectionate. In a Bengali recension of the Ramayana, however, the paradise of Uttarakuru is located beyond the Salada River, in a place where kichaka reeds grow. With this, we find what appears to be a direct correspondence between Indian and Chinese material on a northern kingdom of women. A number of Tang period sources from China describe the land called Supa-na, a transliteration of the Sanskrit Salvarna, golden, or Salvarna Gotra, golden race. Located in the region of Khotan to the north of Kashmir, the west of Tibet, and the south of a kingdom of dogs, which they identify as a kingdom of women. They moreover conflate this kingdom of women with the land of the Supai Huns. The Chinese sources further locate this kingdom of women on the Zhou Shui or Weak River, which scholars have identified with Ctesias' Silas and Megasthene's Side, Greek transliterations of the Silota of Indian traditions, and with the modern Khotan River. Thus, it is possible to extrapolate from the Indian and Chinese material a land to the north of India and the west of Tibet, where dogmen, Amazons, and the Hun barbarians lived side by side, when they were not simply identified with one another, that is. This supplements Indian and Western traditions concerning a land to the northwest of India and far to the east of Europe, where a similar juxtaposition occurred. However, as we have said, the great north of India and the mysterious east of Europe often correspond to the far west of China. We therefore turn to Chinese accounts of its western and northern barbarians. 2. Chinese historiography of Central Asian peoples. In China, we find ourselves in the presence of not one, but two apparently indigenous traditions of Cynanthropy, traditions which the Chinese, moreover, conflate in their accounts of their barbarian neighbors. The peoples with whom these dog ancestry myths are identified vary widely in the Chinese sources, which, in addition to locating kingdoms of dogs, or of dog men, beyond all four limits of its imperial lands, also locate kingdoms of women, sometimes juxtaposed with or in proximity to its kingdoms of dogs, in no less than 3 and as many as 7 different liminal locations. Also unique in the Chinese case is the fact that there are indigenous accounts that verify the Chinese material, in which the ethnic peoples themselves claim descent from the union of a human and a dog or wolf. At first blush, then, the Chinese material seems to have some basis in solid ethnography. However, the possibility of a Chinese pizza effect must not be wholly discounted. We will return to the ethnographic features of Chinese accounts of Cynanthropic barbarians shortly. But before doing so, we must first outline, in a preliminary fashion, what happens when one tradition interprets another tradition that has no historic or literary voice of its own. Of the 2 dogman races of Chinese tradition, one was never able to tell its own story, and the second has only recently done so through the writings of modern ethnographers. The first of these traditions is that of Xiangnu, China's northern and western barbarians. The second is that of the Yao, Liao, or Man, China's southern barbarians. In both cases, at least down to the past century, nearly all that was known of these peoples was refracted through the writings of the Chinese annalists or historians. As we will see, these Chinese commentators, in their writings, had certain barbarian genres to respect, and their portrayals of these peoples were thus necessarily skewed. On the one hand, these barbarians were considered to be the ethnic or racial inferiors of the Chinese, living in a perpetual state of exile. On the other, they were incorporated, even if their inclusion amounted to ideological exclusion, into Chinese cosmology, history, and cosmography. The result of this double deformation of these people's identity was the mythologization of their history, society, and culture. In this, the Chinese treatment of their others was similar to the two other great traditions we have already reviewed. In all three cases, a number of people conflated into a single, generally undifferentiated group were depicted as semi-human monsters with subhuman behavior and social practices. These foreign or barbarian others were generally defined by their exclusion from or their opposition to the categories of the civilized sphere of the great traditions. At worst, they were the bestial enemies or prey of the traditions in question. At best, they were their slaves, servants, vassals, or social inferiors. The imperial attitude towards barbarians is made most clear in the opening pages of the Manchu, an AD 864 source on the Man barbarians of the Yunnan and the oldest Chinese geographical record. While its author, Fan Chou, presents a quite detailed account of the tribes and subgroups of the barbarians of the province he administers, the general note of disdain is most apparent. If then we do not invade and attack them from all four sides, they are violent and bad persons and difficult to reform. That is why I record their cities and garrison towns, their river valleys and plains, mere dust defiling the audience screen of the imperial apartments. Perhaps one might hope to wipe out their host of ant swarms and purge forever these barbarian rebels. Parallels between the three traditions are particularly tantalizing with regard to accounts of Cynanthropy. As we have intimated, there is a certain intersection in these three traditions of the geographic localizations of the dogman races. The vortex of all three would be the vast region of Central Asia, or Turkestan. This region has historically been the home of the Central Asian nomads, for the most part the Altaic-speaking Turco-Mongols. While the area has been inhabited by dozens of distinct peoples, these have generally been grouped under various all-purpose names that have changed over the ages. Scythian, Parthian, Hun, Turk, and Mongol are all terms commonly employed by all three great traditions. We may infer, then, that it has been the Central Asian nomads who have been the prime candidates among the Europeans, Indians, and Chinese for identification with their dogmen. We have also noted that in all three interpretive traditions, these synanthropized Central Asian peoples have quite often been juxtaposed with an Amazonian race of women. We may suggest another parallel between these three traditions, this time a philological one. It may be that the terms for dog or hound in the three languages are linguistic cognates. This is certainly the case with European and Indian terms, as both share a common Indo-European vocabulary, leaving no question that the Sanskrit svan is directly related to the Greek kwan, the Latin canis, and so on. But what of the Chinese term, chuan? The word is structurally very similar to the Indo-European terms. Cultural diffusion on a linguistic level, either between Chinese and the Indo-European languages, or from a Central Asian source into both Chinese and Indo-European vocabularies, it should be recalled that the dog originated from Central Asia, ought not to be rejected out of hand. This philological parallelism is supported by similarities in the cultural uses made of dogs among both the archaic Chinese and the barbarians. In both cases, the dog bore strong associations with death. The Shang emperors may have been buried together with their watchdogs. Dog figurines were buried with the Han emperors, probably to protect them as watchdogs after death. The absence of such figurines between Shang and Han times may be attributed to an interim use of straw dogs buried in place of the animals themselves. Straw dogs are still used among China's northern ethnic populations today. In both the ancient Chinese and the more recent barbarian cases, the dog serves as a psychopomp through the underworld. 3. Towards a derivative history of the ahistorical peoples of Central Asia. The time has come to trace as well as possible the history of the Central Asian peoples whose erstwhile fate it was to become the dogmen of the three traditions we have been examining. In addition to the Chinese historical annals, which are quite detailed and objective, we can also draw upon Chinese epigraphy, archaeology, and philology, as well as on Western and Indian historiography. In the earliest Chinese references to the barbarians they would later call the Xiangnu, this people is called Xianyun or Hunyu, and made one of three subgroups of a northern barbarian people known as the Jung. The Jung were apparently a perennial threat to the Chinese from the very beginnings of their imperial history. As we will detail in the next chapter, the earliest mythic conflict between the Jung and the Chinese, recorded in a 4th century AD source, is set in the time of a Xia Empire Kaoxin, traditionally dated to the 24th century BC. It is doubtful that either Kaoxin or the war that he fought in this account were anything but legendary. However, it is noteworthy that Kaoxin's adversaries in this myth are designated as Chuanzhong, or the Dog Jung. Following the Xia, the Shang, whose traditional dates are 1783 to 1122 BC, too, are said to have been harassed by the Jung. While references to the Jung of this period do not explicitly qualify them as dogs, there is much philological evidence for such an implicit assumption on the part of the Chinese. All Chinese barbarians had animal radicals of one kind or another in their ideograms, since the barbarians were, in the eyes of the empire, subhuman. Following the Shang era, the Dog Jung were vassals to the Zhou dynasty. That they were not always loyal tributaries to their imperial lords is made clear in the Shi Qi, the historical memoirs of Sima Qian. According to this source, the Dog Jung, on several occasions, alone or in alliance with pretenders to the imperial throne, attacked Zhou. After one such attack, in which the Dog Jungs had been enlisted in the cause of a certain Duke of Shen, Zhou, after reasserting its power, moved its capital east, from Hao to Luoyang. This shift, in 770 BC, marks the division of this dynasty into its western and eastern periods. The Chinese capital would remain in Luoyang down to the early 4th century AD, when northern barbarians would once more force the empire into retreat. Shi Huangti, the founder of the short-lived but powerful Qin dynasty, 225 to 206 BC, was a native of the feudal state of Qi, a state with a high proportion of Dogjun in its population. Following Qin, the Dogjun seemed to disappear from the imperial frontiers. However, their disappearance more or less coincided with the rise of the Xiangnu, ferocious slaves. The Great Wall of China was erected in the 3rd century BC, with the expressed purpose of walling the Xiangnu out and stopping their invasions from the north. In fact, the Chinese themselves had at least one pseudo-Methodian tradition that prophesied a reversal of Xiangnu encroachments on the Middle Kingdom. So, in the Hao Han Shu, we read, "The oracle used to say that in the 9th generation of the Xiangnu, the northern barbarians would be driven back over an extent of 1,000 li. Surely this must be it." The 4 centuries that followed saw the rise and fall of great empires on both sides of the wall. To the 2 Han dynasties of China, there corresponded the 2 empires of the Xiangnu. Throughout this period, and in spite of their perennial rivalry, these 2 great Eastern powers came to respect one another, to influence each other culturally and politically, and to cooperate with one another to the point of exchanging their princesses and intermarrying their princely families. Towards the beginning of the Common Era, the Xiangnu split into northern and southern kingdoms, after which time the Han-Xiangnu stalemate was broken in favor of Han. A last Xiangnu hurrah came in the early 4th century AD, when a short-lived southern Xiangnu dynasty, which called itself the Northern Han Dynasty, occupied Luoyang, to which the Chinese had been pushed by the Jung into Zhou and pushed the Chinese further to the south. It was at this time that the imperial capital was shifted to present-day Nanking on the southern shore of the Yangtze River in AD 318. This southward dislocation of the Chinese also pushed the Man or Yao peoples south and east from their original homelands in Hunan and Zhejiang into Fujian, Annam, and Yunnan. Throughout the many centuries of their imperial rivalry, the strategic movements of Han and Xiangnu set up repercussions that rippled to the west and south from northern Turkestan into the expatriate Greek kingdoms of Bactria, Sogdia, and Fargana, the Indian regions of Gandhara, Kashmir, the Punjab, and Sindh, and eventually the Eastern and Western Roman Empire, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa. We will limit ourselves here to describing the movements of peoples provoked by Sino-Xiangnu interactions into India and Europe. The earliest of these was the northern Xiangnu attack in about 165 BC on the Yuqi, a people living to the west of them. This pushed the Yuqi south and west. When they crossed over the Oxus River into Bactria, they conquered the Tocharians living there. This in turn dislodged a people called the Sake, the Sakas, who pushed southward into Sindh and on into central India. In the meantime, the Yuqi split into 5 principalities, Jabgus. One of these, the Jabgu of Kuai Shang, so called because he was from Gandhara, modern Kandahar, conquered his 4 fellow Jabgus and founded the dynasty that would be known in northern India as the Kushan dynasty, Kuai Shang. The changing Central Asian scene translated in India into successive waves of invasion. First, the Sakas rushed in from the northwest, to be followed by the Bactrian Greeks, Yavanas, and then the Kushans. These 3 foreign groups, the peoples called Malechas in the epics and Puranas, ruled parts of India from about 200 BC to AD 220. Even after these empires fell to the Guptas, some of them maintained small kingdoms in northern and central India for many centuries. In the 5th century, the Kushans, driven out of northern India, reconquered the 5 Yuqi tribes north of Gandhara. During this time, a Yuqi people known as the Hua rose to prominence in Tokharistan, establishing their capital at Badakhshan, near present-day Faizabad. These came to be known throughout the eastern and western world as the Hephthalites or White Huns. Their push into India and later into Western Asia was apparently precipitated by pressure exerted from the north by the Avars, a people to whom they had been vassals of sorts. Apart from their Ephthalite vassals, the Avars are also lords of the Tuchu, the Turks, who would overthrow them in 552. The Ephtalites themselves were either a branch of the Yuqi or a people originating from Tufan, Tibet, the same region the Dogjun were said to inhabit from the Han period onwards. They first moved through Kashgaria and Sogdia, and then occupied Bactria, establishing their capital near modern Herat in western Afghanistan. In this way, the Ephthalites became neighbors of the Sassanid Empire of Persia, with whom they were constantly at odds from about AD 430 to 510. Towards the end of this period, however, Ephthalite attention was turned more and more towards India to the south. Their arrival on the Indian scene in about AD 470 sounded the end of the classic age of the Guptas. Ruling from their capital in Sakala, Sialkot, they tyrannized the subcontinent for some 50 years until their empire was overthrown by a popular revolt led by Yasodharman of Malava. They continued, however, to rule over scattered kingdoms in India well into the 11th century. As we discussed earlier in this chapter, the Ephthalite Huns were unique among Central Asian peoples known to the Indians in their practice of polyandry, under which a single wife married a group of brothers. The Ephtalites were also unique among Huns in that they were likely of Indo-European rather than Turco-Mongolian stock. They apparently spoke a variant of Tocharian, an Indo-European language, and were called white Huns for their skin color, according to Western sources. The same sorts of pressures as experienced in South Asia, originating with movements of the Xiangnu in the east, came to change the face of the Western world in about the same period. It was the ensuing westward migrations that fueled the Western traditions of northern barbarian and monster races discussed in chapters 2 and 3. In fact, the names of most of these nomadic people who seemingly roamed across Asia like so many bumper cars would come to be enshrined among the inclusi of the Alexander legend, not only in Pseudo-Methodius, but also in many later Western sources. In AD 89 to 91, a series of defeats suffered by the northern Xiangnu at the hands of their southern brothers and the Chinese forced them into Central Asia, where they disappeared. It has been long thought that it was the same northern Xiangnu who reappeared as the Huns of European tradition, who conquered their western neighbors, the Alani, in the middle of the 4th century. We will return to this question in due course. The Huns themselves first appeared on the shores of the Don, on the threshold of Europe, in 374. In the 100 years that followed, the pressure of the Huns on the eastern border of the Roman Empire forced both Germanic tribes and other Central Asian peoples to move into Roman territories. So it was that in 410, the Visigoth king Alaric sacked Rome and effectively brought an end to Roman imperial pretensions. At the same time, the displaced Suevi, Vandals, and Alani pushed into Gaul and Spain, and eventually North Africa. For a brief time, the Huns themselves controlled a vast territory stretching from the Caspian nearly to the North Sea. However, following Attila's untimely death in 453, they were driven back eastward into southern Russia and the north shore of the Black Sea, where they were perhaps transformed in ecclesiastic traditions into the man-eaters encountered by such apostles as Andrew and Bartholomew. It is certain that the Huns were already well on their way in the 5th century to being conflated with a host of other barbarians from the east, including Pliny's Thuni, Ptolemy's Chunoi, and a number of other peoples previously grouped under the same general heading of Scythians. If nothing else, this brief sketch of the role played by the Central Asian peoples in world history, that is, in the history of the 3 great traditions of China, India, and Europe, is intended to show just how varied those people were, whom our historical sources generally group under one heading. Another important implication is the constant presence at a distance in the historiography, and perhaps the present to court of these barbarian peoples, to the conceptual continuity of the great traditions. In fact, when we examine the chronologies of Europe, India, and China, we find sizable chunks of history in which barbarians were the outright lords of civilization. However, the invasion and occupation of any of these civilizations by the Huns per se, the Huns in Europe, the Hunas in India, and the Xiangnu in China, were extremely limited in duration, especially in comparison to the polemics subsequently raised against them. The historical breakdowns of Hun occupation are as follows. Northern China fell under the domination of the southern Xiangnu, or some Altaic-speaking people, for about 300 years, from the late 3rd century to AD 581. Between the fall of Tang in 908 and the formation of the People's Republic in 1949, large parts of China were also ruled by non-Chinese for over 400 years. The Xiangnu, however, remained outside of China, in Mongolia during their period of relative strength, between 202 BC and AD 216, and only occupied northern China proper between AD 311 and 349. Much of northwest India was ruled by Central Asians for the 4 centuries straddling the dawn of the Common Era, and by foreign barbarians of one sort or another from the 10th to 20th centuries. But here too, Huna denomination per se was limited to a period of 30 years in the first half of the 6th century. The Roman Empire fell to barbarian onslaughts in the 5th century, with the Huns ruling parts of Europe, mainly under Attila, for 28 years, from AD 441 to 469. Soon after this time in the West, most of Europe's barbarians gained a new common identity, an identity rooted in their conversion to Christianity and in the Christianized reinterpretation of the Roman Empire they had brought down. No sooner had this conversion occurred, however, than did Europe or Christendom find itself besieged by a new sort of infidel, the Muslim, with whom its conflict has never truly ceased. Two questions must be posed, questions we will address at length in the final portion of this book. First, why were the Huns singled out as the boogeymen of these traditions, in spite of the extremely brief periods of their occupation of the three great civilizations? Second, how much were the self-identities of these great traditions, for all their ideological bluster and self-assuredness, shaped by the presence of others, often wrongly identified with the Huns on their borders, on the perceived limits of their selves? 4. The dog Jung and the Central Asian dog ancestry traditions. The earliest case of a Chinese identification of a barbarian group with the canine species is that of the dog Jung. This barbaric people, Jung means wild, warlike, barbaric, are located in the geography of the tribute of Yu to the northwest of Shang, China. Later, in the approximately 4th century BC Shanghai Qing, they are situated in the Great Northern Wilderness, corresponding to the modern provinces of Shanxi and Shanxi. These dog Jung are said, in the same source, to be descended from a pair of white dogs, or from a white dog with two heads. The dog Jung ancestry myth is our earliest Chinese source for northern and western barbarian traditions of dog ancestry. Here, we are referring in general terms to Central Asian peoples in contrast to China's southern or eastern barbarians, some of whom had similar ethnogenic myths. The northern and western traditions thus comprise the ancestry myths of such diverse, yet ethnically or culturally related peoples as the Kyrgyz, Kazakhs, Mongols, Tungus, Uyghurs, Chaitans, Turks, Tibetans, Koreans, Ainus, and Eskimos, to which we might add the Hungarians, Finns, and Estonians, as well as the ancient Scythians reported by Herodotus of different ethnic backgrounds. In a general sense, these are Altaic peoples, descended from the Proto-Turks, Proto-Mongols, and Proto-Tungus of Central and Northern Asia. These myths are most similar to, and probably because they were the source of, the European myths of Amazon women and their cynocephalic men. An Altaic myth belonging to this northern complex probably lies at the source of a report brought back to the West by the Franciscan missionary John of Plano Carpini in 1247, following a stay among the Mongols. Plano Carpini's account mentions Tartars. These are the Mongols who presumably told him the story. Here, their rivals, the dog soldiers of Nochoi Khazar, meaning dog country in the Mongol language, are peoples living to the north of them. The Tartars, however, proceeded to the southeast and marching for more than a month through the desert, reached the land of dogs, which in Tartar is called Nochoi Khazar, for Nochoi means dog in Tartar and Khazar means land. They found only women there, without men, and taking 2 of these prisoner, they waited by the river which flows through the middle of the country. They asked the women where and of what kind the men were, and they replied that they were dogs by nature, and had crossed over the river on hearing of the enemy's approach. On the 3rd day, all the dogs in the country were seen to be gathering, and when the Tartars made mock of them, they crossed the river and rolled themselves in the sand, which owing to the coldness of the weather then froze. For a 2nd and 3rd time they did the same, and, as the dogs, they were shaggy, the mixture of ice and sand froze a hand's breadth thick. This done, they charged upon the Tartars, who laughed and began to shoot them with their arrows, but succeeded in killing a very few, as it was impossible to wound them except in the mouth or eyes. But the dogs ran swiftly up, throwing a horse to the ground with one bite and throttling it with the next. The Tartars, seeing that neither arrow nor sword could hurt the dogs, took to flight, and the dogs pursued them for 3 days, killed very many, dismissed them from their country, and so had peace from them ever after. One of the Tartars even told Friar Benedict that his father was killed by the dogs at that time, and Friar Benedict believes beyond doubt that he saw one of the dog's women with the Tartars, and says she had even borne male children from them, but the boys were monsters. The aforesaid dogs are exceptionally shaggy and understand every word the women said, while the women understand the dog's sign language. If a woman bears a female child, it has a human form like the mother, while, if the child is a male, it takes the shape of a dog like the father. Plano Carpini also mentions a Mongol account of a people living to the north of the Samoyeds. This too is recorded with variations in the Tartar relation. The people are called Ukur Kolan, that is ox feet, because Ukur is Tartar for ox and Kolan for foot, or otherwise Nochoi Terim, that is dog heads, Nochoi being Tartar for dog and Terim for head. They have feet like oxen from the ankles down, and a human head from the back of the head to the ears, but with a face in every respect like a dog's, and for that reason they take their name from the part of them which is monstrous in form. They speak 2 words and bark the third, and so can be called dogs for this reason also. A Western account of the same century and no doubt the same origin as Plano Carpini's is that attributed to a certain Armenian King Hetun I, who traveled to the Far East in 1255 and 1266. There exists beyond the Kitai a land where the women have a human face and are possessed of human reason, and where the men have the form of dogs and are great and hairy and without reason. These dogs allow no one to enter into their territory, and nourish themselves and their women with the game they catch. The males born from the commerce of these dogs with their women resemble dogs, and the females human women. Earlier than either of these Western sources is an account by a Chinese traveler named Hu Chiao, who was retained among the Turco-Mongol Chai Tan, the Kitai of the preceding account, who ruled over an area corresponding to modern Manchuria, in the middle of the 10th century, and gave the following account of a kingdom of dogs to the north of the Chai Tan. Further to the north is the kingdom of dogs, where the inhabitants have the bodies of men and the heads of dogs. They have long hair. They have no clothes. They have overcome wild beasts with their bare hands. Their language is the barking of dogs. Their women have a human form and can speak Chinese. When they give birth to males, they have the form of dogs. When they give birth to females, these have the form of humans. They intermarry, live in caves, and eat their food raw. Their women and girls are man-eaters. It is said that a man from the Middle Kingdom once came into this country. The women he met there had pity on him and helped him to escape. She gave him a dozen chopsticks and advised him to drop one every 10 li. The male dogs pursued him, but, seeing their household utensils, they stopped to pick them up with their mouths. In this way, they were unable to pursue him. Such is the story that is told. These 3 accounts of the Italian Plano Carpini, the Armenian Hetun, and the Chinese Hu Chiao all concern the same peoples, the Chai Tan and their northern neighbors, and the same region, Manchuria, and points north. In his account, Plano Carpini describes the dog soldiers of Nochoi Kadzar, and explains that Nochoi Gajar means dog country in the Mongol language. There was, in fact, a Mongol people who called themselves Nokai Kuan, sons of dogs. This name is moreover identical with that of a 10th century Chai Tan ritual that's celebrated on the 8th day of the 8th month, August, the dog days of northern China as well, the Dog's Head Festival, Nai Ho in the Chai Tan language, Tan Ho Nai in Chinese, a commemoration of the canine ancestor of the race, whose name was Nai Ho, Dog Skull. On this day, the ruler of the country killed a white dog 7 feet from his sleeping tent. He buried the dog so that only its muzzle was left uncovered. After 7 days, he transplanted his tent over the head of the buried dog. This canine founder of the race, named Nai Ho, related in the Mongol languages to the term Nokai or Nochoi, was worshipped as a skull on this day. The name of the Chai Tan imperial family was, in fact, Nohai Ilu Su. Their name meant the Ilu of dogs. A source from the Sung era, AD 960 to 1280, further identifies the Ilu Su, the name of the Khitan royal family, with a northern people called the It Barak. It Barak, literally shaggy dog, or Barak, is also the name of a fantastic dog born from the last 2 eggs laid by a goshawk. According to the Muslim author Rashid ed-Din, It Barak was the adversary of Kara Barak, the black dog, and gave his name to a kingdom. This author describes the men of It Barak as dark brown and of mongrel visage, the women as cat-like in shape and dog-like in manner. The same author gives an account of Oguz Kahan, a legendary ancestor of the Turks and Mongols, who defeats a group called the Kilbarak, in spite of a stratagem that was nearly identical to that of the dogs whom the Tartars faced in Plano Carpini's and Dibradia's attack. The Kilbarak natives prepare their heroes by dipping them in glue and sand to make them invulnerable to arrows. It is through a strange twist of fate that the lot of the Khitan remains intertwined with that of dogmen in later traditions as well. After the fall of their Manchurian Empire early in the 12th century, the Khitan were pushed far to the south and west into the region between Lake Baikal and the Jaxartes River, where they converted to become Nestorian Christians and came to be known as the Karakitai. It was this people and their ruler Wang Khan who were identified in rumors spread westward by the Nestorians around AD 1145, with the kingdom of Prester John, an earthly paradise in which it will be recalled the peaceable dogmen were said to live. The Tibetans produce an account of northern provenance which bears a certain resemblance to those we have so far reviewed. This is a report given by 5 Uyghurs of their travels through Central Asia. This 8th century account combines a myth of canine ancestry with other themes we have already observed, including polyandry. The first dogs were descended from heaven, a red dog and a black dog. These had a she-wolf for their wife, but they were unable to have children by her. They then ravished a Drugu Turk girl. From their union with this girl, the male children were dogs and the females were of the human race and were true girls. The race born from the red dog was called Jizir Guzu. The race born from the black dog was called Gara Gusu. The girl was mistress of all their wealth, their herds and their food. These dogs and their women speak in the Drugu language, and through the use of signs. The same Tibetan account concerning these Uyghurs relates how 2 soldiers from the army of Zama Kagan became lost in a desert of dunes. They wandered into the land of dogs, where a young woman, the wife of the dogs from the above account, and her dog husband came to their rescue and helped them return to Drugu country. There are several accounts from later, mainly Chinese traditions, that parallel those we have reviewed so far, inasmuch as they juxtapose or identify lands of Amazon women with those of dog men. They differ, however, on one important point. Nearly all of these later accounts of dog men and Amazon women locate them far to the east, either on the far northeastern coast of Tartary or across the Eastern Sea. This shift may be ascribed to a poverty of Chinese geographical knowledge, parallel to that of Western traditions of the Alexander legend, which also tended to identify eastern Siberia with the northern or Eastern Sea. Alongside this later northeastern maritime location, the Chinese continued to maintain traditions of kingdoms of dogs, often connected in some way to kingdoms of women to the west in Tibet and Central Asia, and to the south in southeastern China and Indochina. Before discussing these Chinese variants, however, we would do well to first examine the indigenous Central Asian origins of the themes we have seen thus far. In the Uyghur travel account cited above, we are told that the women who live with dogs are found in the land of the Turks, Drugu, or to the north of this land. In Hu Qiao's account, the land of the dogs is also to the north, beyond the Khitan. Finally, Plano Carpini's and Hetun's narratives place the dogmen to the north of the land of the Tartars, Mongols. In fact, all of these peoples, the Turks, Tibetans, Khitan, and the Mongols, as well as many of their neighbors, have their own dog or wolf ancestry traditions. The earliest of these, transmitted by the Chinese shortly before the beginning of the Common Era, is that of the Wu Huan, who were at the time living north of the Jaxartes River, to the northwest of Tibet. One very early version of the legend is worth reproducing in full, because it bears a tantalizing resemblance to Herodotus' account of the birth of Cyrus, and thus perhaps betrays a connection with Indo-European tradition. According to this account, the Wu Huan were forced, shortly after the birth of a young prince, to seek refuge in the kingdom of the Xiangnu, the Xiangnu. The child's preceptor fled into the desert, taking the infant with him. One day, when he returned from begging for food, he found a she-wolf suckling the child, and a crow with a piece of meat in its beak flying over him. He then felt the child to be holy, and resolved to take him to Xiangnu. The Xiangnu loved him and raised him. When he had grown up, they gave him the people that had belonged to his father and placed him at the head of an army. In the centuries that follow, Chinese sources cite other wolf ancestry myths, some involving the union of human women with male wolves with regard to a number of Central Asian peoples. A very precious source for such traditions is the Bugut stele, which, dating from AD 581, is the oldest archaeological artifact of the Tu-Chue, the Turks. This stele is crowned by an image of a she-wolf suckling an infant. Upon it is inscribed the ancestry myth of the Tu-Chue, according to which the last survivor of the ancestors of the Tu-Chue, themselves a branch of the Xiangnu, was a 10-year-old boy. He was left to die by enemy soldiers, who cut off his feet. A she-wolf found him and fed him with meat. He grew up and united with her. She went to a cave in a mountain to the north of the Tufan in Tibet. There she gave birth to 10 boys, who took wives from the outside. From their union, the race was founded. The Xiangnu may themselves have been descended from a dog-gray wolf, if we are to trust accounts given by the Chinese. Indeed, the Pi-Shi, History of the North, and the Wei-Shu, History of the Wei Dynasty, offer the following account of the origins of the Xiangnu. There is a folktale to the effect that a Xiangnu named Tan Yu, father, begat 2 daughters, who were so beautiful that people took them for goddesses. Tan Yu said, "With these 2 daughters, how can I find husbands good enough for them? I'll present them to heaven." So he built a tall tower in the north of the country where no one lived, and put his 2 girls on top of it, saying, "I invite heaven to receive them." After a year, an old wolf came and prowled about the base of the tower in the deep of the night and howled. The younger daughter said, "Our father put us here in order to present us to heaven. Now that this wolf has come, perhaps it is a divine being sent by heaven." And with this she started to climb down. Her elder sister cried, "That's a wild animal, not fit to become a mother-in-law with." But the younger girl disregarded her words, and descended to become the wolf's wife. She gave birth to a son. In later times, this progeny multiplied into a whole country. That is why these people like to sing songs which sound like a wolf's howl. The lupine myth of the Turks must still have been current in the time of Chinggis Khan, for we find it again, somewhat altered, in the 14th century Yuan Chao Pi-Shi, Secret History of the Mongols, which opens with these lines, the origin of Chinggis Khan. There was a bluish wolf, Vortex, which was born having his destiny from heaven above. His spouse was a wild she-dog, Kowai Moral. And some verses later, it is said that Chinggis Khan himself was descended from the union of Alan Kawa, a human woman with a shining yellow man who, when he moved, resembled a yellow dog. The yellow man or dog was considered to be an incarnation of heaven. Another 14th century Mongol source, the Altan Topchi, states that Alankoa gave birth to 3 sons, whose conception she described in the following terms. "In the dark night, a shining young man entered, his brilliance penetrating into my tent. When he rubbed my belly, he became a black dog and departed, licking his chops." Perhaps by virtue of a Mongol influence, the lupine ancestry myth is one that is widespread among the peoples of Central Asia. But so too is the canine ancestry myth. Whether the latter is a variant of the former or an independent tradition that became conflated with the former, as in the Mongol tradition, is an insoluble problem. Let us mention, in this context, a Bulgarian account of the Turks, whom they say sprang from the union between a princess and a dog. Now, according to a folk song, the cynocephalic Turks are eating Bulgar children. A number of northern Siberian peoples have canine ancestry myths. They include the reindeer Chinggis of Manchuria, who claimed descent from a bitch and a man who descended from heaven. The Koryaks and the Chukchi. The Ainu of Sakhalin and the Hokkaido also have a dog ancestry myth. Their name, moreover, like that of the North American Eskimos, the Inuit, may mean dogs. The earliest extant literary fragment from Japanese tradition, the 8th century Kojiki, relates a dog legend concerning the 5th century emperor, Juliaku. We have already noted the many Chinese, Indian, and Western references to dogmen and kingdoms of women in Central Asia and Tibet, far to the west of China. Once again, these refer to various peoples of Turco-Mongol background, and of the Altaic language group whose homelands shifted across the great north and far west of China, according to the movements of their neighbors. An example we have already noted is that of the Khitan of Manchuria, who in the 12th century were forced thousands of miles to the south and west into Transoceania. Another people living in the west of the Middle Kingdom are the Kyrgyz, whose indigenous dog ancestry myth also serves as a folk etymology of their name, Kyrgyz meaning 40 girls. Here, the 40 companions of a Khanes return from an excursion to find their camp devastated. The only living creature they find is a red dog. A year later, and presumably through the effort of the dog, the little colony has doubled in size. The Kazakhs and Tanguts of the same region also possess a dog ancestry myth. Still further to the west, the Persians and Armenians have similar traditions. In this context, let us also recall the dog-headed demons of Tibet, the pre-5th century stucco head of such a demon unearthed at Hada, discussed at the beginning of this chapter. Lastly, let us recall the Chinese and Indian traditions of a Striryaja or kingdom of women located above Kashmir to the west of Tibet and to the south of a kingdom of dogs in Tang Chinese sources, women whose men were identified with the Supai Huns. These Western Chinese traditions of a kingdom of women and a kingdom of dogs in the region of Tibet complement those related to in northern Khitan, in which dogmen live together with Amazon women in northeastern Tartary or across the northern sea. Earlier than nearly all of these traditions are Chinese accounts of eastern seas, or more properly speaking, southeastern seas. This third center for Chinese dogman Amazon traditions points to China's southern barbarians, as well as to related peoples from Indochina. The earliest mention of eastern Amazons is found in the 2nd century BC Huanan Su. The first full-blown narrative concerning eastern Amazons and dogmen is an account attributed to Hui Shen of an encounter that purportedly occurred in AD 507. More than 1,000 li east of Fusang, itself said to be more than 20,000 li to the east of the northeasternmost country known to the Chinese, there is a kingdom of women. These women are beautifully shaped and of a pure white color. Their body is hairy, and the hair of their heads is so long that it trails on the ground. In the 2nd or 3rd moon, they eagerly enter into the water and become pregnant, and give birth to children in the 6th or 7th moon. These women have no breasts on the chest, but at the nape of the neck, hair grows on white stems. In these hairs is a juice with which they suckle their children. In the year 507, a man of Chinan, Fujian province, while crossing the sea, was blown adrift by the wind to an island and went ashore. People lived there. The women were like those of China, although their language could not be understood. The men had human bodies, but dogs' heads, and their voice was a sort of barking. They built up walls of earth of a round shape, the door of which was like a dog entrance. Hui Shen's kingdom of dogs, that is also a kingdom of women, has been identified by certain scholars with the Ainu of northeastern peninsular and insular Asia. A most imaginative interpretation belongs to Gustav Schlegel, for whom this account refers to the matriarchal Kurile fishing communities of Kamchatka, Korea, or Hokkaido, with the dogmen husbands of these women being none other than sea lions. This maritime venue of a kingdom of women is in fact a perennial one in traditions from all over the world. An illustrious Western example being Adam of Bremen's description of the land of the Amazons in his Gesta Hammaburgensis. In Adam's account, it will be recalled that the Terra Feminarum was located on an eastern shore of the Baltic. Here, Amazon women, living together with cynocephalic men, conceived either by mere exposure to blowing wind or by drinking water. There are, in fact, a great number of Asian sources that provide the same description of Amazon women living together with dog men who often conceived by bathing in a well or river or by exposing themselves to the wind. If these similarities are indicative of a cultural diffusion, one wonders what route and through which traditions the account traveled. As we shall see in the next chapter, the location of this land off a southeastern coastline corresponds to that of a certain dog fief country to which Pan Hu, the canine ancestor of the southern Man barbarians, was sent together with his wife. One of the earliest sources on Pan Hu is the 5th century Ho Han Shu, a text that bears certain parallels with many other sources we have reviewed, inasmuch as it juxtaposes its description of the dog men descended from Pan Hu with that of a kingdom of women. So it is that the 115th chapter of the Ho Han Shu is consecrated to the kingdom of women, which it locates on an eastern island, and the 116th to the myth of Pan Hu and the canine ancestry of the southern Man barbarians. We now turn to this latter tradition.